scary.
It wasn't scary.
Exactly.
So he came across as this great father figure. And so, we just listened to him. He was great, easy to talk to. Like you said, he was not a mean manager. He was nothing. He was the opposite of Dilbert's boss, everything. It's hard to imagine. I don't know if you know about him, but he designed the first first watch chip and the first calculator chip. He worked on those back in...
He was such a wonderful guy. It was humble, doesn't go far enough in describing him. He just seemed like such a normal, wonderful person. It never came to mind that he was this great technical person, and he was one of the fathers of the video game business, one of the co-designers of the VCS, co-designer of the Atari 400-800, and co-designer of the Commodore Amiga.
We knew from the very beginning that we didn't want to do a straight bitmap for two reasons. One is we couldn't afford all the memory, but also the coin-op architecture had hardware sprites. They weren't generalizable, but there was a minimum amount of silicon that was required in order to move things around in real time. So, in fact, that actually was a sprite architecture that came from Nolan in the very first coin-op video game, Computer Space. And we took that same architecture from Computer Space, Al took it through Pong. It went through all the coin-op games, and Ron and I took that architecture and made it much more efficient for silicon, and also made it generalizable.
Of course, we didn't actually take the architecture from Computer Space because nobody could ever understand Nolan's schematic.
But it was the idea.
But it was the idea of taking a bitmap in a little area that could be moved around by giving it a where to be on the screen and the graphics instead of having to fill a whole screen.
We always called them stamps in the early days.
Yep.
But, and then ultimately it got attached and called
It was called sprites because I think TI called it sprites because that was a fallout of Seymour Papert and Logo calling it sprites. And he was working with TI. But this whole connection of coin-op was just absolutely essential, that even in cyan engineering, Atari had us run a small coin-op route. So in order to make money for our engineering parties, you had to go out there and collect coins. So there was this tremendous continuity along the way. And all we had to do, not to minimize what it was, but Ron and I then could take the sprites and say, if we want to do this class of games, how do we make it generalizable? How do we make it so that you can make the sprites larger and smaller? How you can take the patterns not just from ROM, but from and strictly in hardware, but from ROM that's associated with the computer, and then have the computer loaded into a RAM. So an awful lot of the benchmark was already done before us. As an engineer, what you always wanted more than anything else is a clearly defined problem. So here's a budget, here's a schedule, and here, do this 5 games. It was a very clean universe. And I think, talking to the programmers, I think what you also said is that you enjoyed it because it was also a very well-defined, clean universe too. Here were the rules, and there was no legacy that you had to worry about, that the constraints were all there, and then you could just be creative within the constraints.
Yeah.
And our definition of fully general at the time was that it could play Pong, Pong doubles, Quadra Pong, tank, jet fighter, and biplane. That was full. If it could do that, surely it could do everything imaginable.
Oh yeah, there are memos in Larry's document that talk about that thing with a 4K ROM, that set of games as a dedicated, programmed internally but not exposed product. That was the target vision in September of '76.
But we also knew that if it could do that, it could do very large classes of games.
The whole STELLA has about 5,000 gates, I think it is, compared to a Pentium with about 5 million gates.
Something
so,
like that.
Again, that gets everything focused. And the STELLA originally was going to have 64 bytes RAM, and then we went to the exorbitant amount of 128 bytes of RAM when it went into production.
In that book, there's some calculations that said, here's how many bits we're going to need for the play field and the moving objects and the stack and a few variables, and it was pushing it to squeeze it all into 64. And so we decided to opt to take the extra hit of, so we took the 6530, pulled out the ROM, that made enough room to double the RAM. It saved us $1 approximately to go from the full 40-pin 6502 to what we call the 6507. As part of that, we threw away some address lines, only 8K. And we didn't want to have any address decoding glue, so we used this top address line to distinguish the cartridge from anything on the baseboard. That logically constrains the cartridge to 4K. And then we're sitting in discussions with the people who made these connectors, and they made one that was 24 pins, and they made one that was 30 pins, and so on. And it saved us, a quarter or something to go to the smaller connector. We had a failure of imagination. We didn't expect to put RAM in the cartridge because RAM was very expensive. So we thought, okay, our reference designs, the tank can be in 2K, the Video Olympics can be in 2K, maybe we'll need 4K, but that's fine. So it didn't occur to us to put the read-write line out there.
Phase 2?
Or the clock wires, or extra address lines. Nowadays we can smack ourselves in the head and think, oh, why didn't we do that? Actually, we were smacking ourselves in the head by the summer of 1978, but it was too late already. We had established a market standard for ourselves, and we were bound to it. Look at this game here. The action, the people's eye is focusing on the moving objects. We spent our hardware there. Your eye is not paying a lot of attention to the background. You don't need a lot of bits. You don't need a lot of chip area spent on that stuff. They used a bitmap. So the playfield resolution was better, but who cares? And the object resolution was much worse, which made a lot of difference.
The counters that we used for the sound had a limited resolution in how you could divide the clock, so we couldn't actually hit all the frequencies that you need for music to have the full, they called it a top octave counter to get it just right. So, but we said, people that really play games will put up with kind of music, so we had something like a musical scale, and later on.
440, we ended up with like 438.5. And the next, a B should have been like, 503, and we ended up with like 492. And generally it was flat. Occasionally it was sharp, but we try to pick the frequency closest to the tone. And so the music was always a little bit off, but they gave it a totally unique sound. And to this day, everyone knows that sound.
Yeah.
You close your eyes, and people today know that sound of the Pong, Combat, and all the other games. The whoosh, the hiss, those sounds are unique, and they still play them. Atari is now identified totally with that sound. You hear that sound, and it's Atari.
The original coin-op games were all monochrome, and somebody would determine what the grayscale was. They weren't even on color monitors. Color monitors were way too expensive.
never afford them.
Right. Color monitors. This was new for consumer. In fact, that's why we went with a black and white switch. It's easier to have a small amount of hardware allocated to generating the shape of an object, and then follow that with a little bit more logic that has different colors for each object. And we made it writable, obviously, because it was going to be different colors for different games, rather than hardwiring it. And we thought 3 bits was enough grayscale resolution. It turns out that a 4th bit didn't help us very much, so we saved a resistor and a few parts. And we picked 16 delays of color. The way we generated the color delay was to have a delay line with a lot of taps. And we had a pot on the design where you tweaked it so that you get the whole color wheel.
I'm laughing because this was a time that is long since gone.
Right.
This is not how you're supposed to do it. And I kind of had this idea early on when I did the original home Pong. And what happened was, about halfway through designing the chip, and I think Joe or Nolan came in and says, "There's got to be color." I says, "Great. Well, that'll be easy." So I thought of a piece of test equipment. When I was a youth fixing TVs, there was a cheap thing called a rainbow color bar generator, which just did a cheesy trick of slipping chroma, used a cheesy trick, basically. And so that propagated. Beg your pardon?
It had one whole cycle of delay across the screen.
Right, so I had Pong had color, had all the colors. Red was on the left side, blue was on the right side, and I couldn't change them or anything about them, but you got the color. No one did say which color, it got color. Fine, we shipped it. But then that got better because Jay took it and understood, okay, great, I'm not going to be working about red, green, and blue, I'm really dealing in delay of a color subcarrier and how much color subcarrier controlled how much color, and that became the color model. And shortly thereafter, other products did it the right way. But it's
in retrospect, we wished, and in later products like the Amiga, we did color saturation as well as the color phase. But what we did determine was that if we picked only 8 points around the color wheel, that wasn't adequate. We couldn't get a decent yellow, we couldn't get some other color, and couldn't get a decent orange, for example. But we still got lots of green. So we went to 16 different colors, which was the next notch up, because we could get reasonable approximations around the wheel. So we needed 4 bits to pick color for the palette register. 3 bits was enough for luminance. We had a bit to spare. We threw it away. Somebody had the idea that we might want to play this game. I'm not sure where it came from.
I think it was, what came out is more is better, and it didn't cost anything.
It might have been in Grass Valley.
Yeah, because we had that out
The
there.
width thing as well?
Well, if it didn't cost anything, you might as well put it in, right?
Yes.
Yeah, it just gave anything that gave extra flexibility that sort of fell out of the design we took.
But you understand, the fact that you did that is the whole reason we were able to later rewrite the registers in between and get chess.
And we knew that 3 years from now you were going to, and that 4 years from now that there was going to be somebody in Japan that was going to come up with Space Invaders.
And this was cheap because we had this polynomial counter with a bunch of decodes coming off of it. And one decode said start the object. And it was very easy to put in 2 more lines in the decoder to start it some more times. And so then what we had to do is have a little register that you wrote to that was the mode for that object, which determined how fast it was clocked, because this is clocking it slower, and how many times it was turned on. So one mode is single, one mode is double, one mode is triple. In fact, I think one mode is double in a different way. There are games that do that. The original design was based on a 2-line kernel. There was more work to do in than could fit in one horizontal line, 76 clock ticks. So these guys designed it around 2 horizontal lines worth. Well, why would we have to rewrite a lot of things twice? Or in particular, how do we get 1-line resolution if we're writing it every 2 lines? And so there's a little bit of caching. There is a register and then a backup register behind it for these player objects. And you toggle a bit called the vertical delay bit, which means it either takes it out of the first register or the second register. So we had the hardware doing something that was 1 line of motion vertically.
Because your eye could really detect if it wasn't smooth motion, so you needed the higher resolution for motion, but not for the actual object.
There is 5 moving object generators. Each of them produces a bit. And the bits go into just combinatorial logic, and I think there's 1 or 2 bits in the system that determine priority. But there's some default priority that player 1 has more priority than player 2, that has more priority than background or ball, that has more priority than background. So basically a decision results in 2 bits. The 2 bits select which one of the 4 palette registers is going to be displayed. That's all. That happens on the fly at the very tail end of the logic. So, but I think we have some choices because, like, if you remember from the combat game, if you pick the game with jets and clouds, there's some bits you toggle in the hardware that either put the play field ahead of, higher priority than, the players and missiles, or behind it. So we could, in fact, fly behind clouds.
If there was a choice of making generalizable or not, we would take the generalizable, but realizing that you had to enforce a lot of discipline, because if you make it too generalizable, it never ships. And
shoot the engineer and ship the product.
The project schedule probably around September, October of 1977. And I'm sorry, 1976, for which games would be released for 1977. And I remember interviewing you, Larry Kaplan, and you, Al. Do you remember what month?
I think I interviewed in November, December 76, but I was ultimately hired and joined in February 77.
February 77. And then Bob Whitehead started around...
He started in January 77.
Okay.